And she was being marked by Caroline, who said she absolutely, she gave it 10 out of 10 because she managed to get through it. And so I'm just so grateful I've not had one of those. So they can be really difficult. I think I've only got time to give you two. I have so many favourite funerals. There are ones that the ones that sort of meant the most to me have been the celebrations of unsung heroes, of very ordinary people whose backgrounds are fascinating. It's always interesting to go back to sort of wartime and remind yourself how people lived and, before they had washing machines and things like that, which we take for granted. But actually, that's how people lived their lives. They spent, a woman, a mother of 4 children, really did have a full-time job running a house, mending clothes, sweeping, washing things by hand, hanging them up. I mean, just a grind. And so insights into people's lives like that are great. But as I say, I'm running out of time, and I want to give you two that for me were some of the most special funerals that really sort of summed up why I do it and why I think many of my colleagues do it. And this first remarkable story, which I think Josh has heard before, and maybe one or two of you, maybe David's heard before, because I did give a talk about 5 years ago. But the story of Michael Derwin is, I think, too unusual and exceptional not to tell you about. It begins in 1963 at Blackheath railway station, when a middle-aged gentleman called Basil Savage was on his way home to his comfortable flat when he spotted a pathetic, still wearing his coat. He came back from work. So 24 hours later, the same child was on the same platform, still wearing his coat, and he thought, well, this won't do. And he got into conversation with him and ended up taking him home, because it was cold, he couldn't bear to leave him there, to the home that he shared with his male partner. And Basil Savage was a senior civil servant in a profession in which coming out of the closet was not at that time an option, in the early 60s. But he gradually realised he had to look after this child. Nobody else would. The child's name was Michael Derwin. He'd been born 13 years earlier in Camberwell, one of 14 children in an Irish Catholic family living in 3 rooms. And his upbringing sounds like the stuff of nightmares. His father was a sergeant major who inflicted a reign of terror on his family. Michael was clearly a sensitive boy who tried to protect his mother from his father and thereby put himself in the firing line. When he was 12, his father threw him out of the house and into a local Catholic orphanage from which he'd run away. So after their meeting at Blackheath Station, Michael moved in with Basil Savage. And soon the time came when Basil had to regularise the relationship. He did the proper thing in those days and went to meet the Derwin family, including the dreaded father, and announced his intention to adopt Michael. Michael's father received them in typical fashion, denouncing his son's benefactor and throwing the pair of them out with a volley of abuse. But at Basil's home, Michael, this young boy, discovered a new life. The shelves were stocked with great literature and lovely music and play, and he became a real culture vulture. He studied engineering. He joined Marconi as an apprentice and sent to work in Denmark. From 1973 to 79, he lived and worked in Denmark, coming home to Blackheath in the holidays. So his life was completely transformed. He had a succession of girlfriends and seemed to have had a pretty normal life. But he had a very, very special bond with his adopted father, Basil. And in 1979, Basil was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer. And so young Michael just threw up his job and came home to care for him. Happily, Basil made a pretty full recovery, but he was getting on, and they moved to Paddington, near to Maida Vale, where he was receiving treatment in Paddington. So they moved into separate flats, one above the other. And gradually Michael retreated from normal life. And sadly he became increasingly fearful of the outside world. He developed agoraphobia, asthma, spent all his days in his flat. He just joined Basil for meals, and otherwise nobody heard him. He watched classic BBC series like Doctor Who and the Forsyte Saga. He barely knew his first floor neighbours, Tracy Miller, who comes in later. They'd moved in the early 90s, although they were very familiar with the old gentleman with the cane, and they would hear going up and down the stairs. Then one dreadful day, Tracy, who's a hard-smoking, apparently hard-bitten New Yorker, noticed that there was no noise coming from upstairs, and fearing the worst, she knocked on Michael's door. Basil had died in hospital the day before, and Michael was at his wit's end. And so began the third episode in his life, from being rescued on that station platform, given a new life, and then retreating into this mental illness, really. He now embarked on a sort of third stage, something of a renaissance, when Tracy took over, helped him to deal with winding up Basil's estate, sale of the books and installation of a new tenant. Tracy and the new tenant became his third family. They tidied up his junk, and they gave him a new social life gradually. He was treated for his agoraphobia, a helper came round, and Michael, always up for a party according to Tracy, and he had this wonderfully posh voice. I had this vision of him being like Brian Sewell, who, as you all know, I'm sure you know, he was a Bernardo's boy, and Brian Sewell now has this magnificently posh voice. And I think Michael had a very posh voice. And he became the centre of his own salon, as it were, and loved having conversations. He loved women, and now he was kind of well looked after, all away from his family. Ended his life mourned by a number of women who'd become his family, and to whom he was now able to give something in return, because he had inherited all Basil's money. Tracy was hard up after her husband left her, and so he helped her out. He'd helped her out before he died, and he left everything to her. And so you have this strange sort of cycle where Basil Savage's kindness was passed on to someone else who is now benefiting from it, and for all the sadness of Michael's damaged life and the sobering knowledge of the harm that an uncaring adult can do to a child, I can't help finding it a story about the redemptive power of human kindness. A story that began on that station platform when Basil Savage handed a shivering child his coat. So that for me is sort of is what you do it for. It's the sense that everybody's life matters, and that people can rise to great things from weird and terrible beginnings, and something does go on. I mean, we don't believe in an afterlife, but Tracy benefited from Michael, who benefited from Basil, and so there's some sort of continuity there. Okay, was that a signal to wind up? Probably not. I'm going to say the last thing I want to tell you about funerals, the last thing, which again is kind of why I do it, was at 7/7 when a bus was blown up just outside here, and those bombs went off in the tube. Two women who worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital were among the casualties, and I was asked to conduct a memorial service on behalf of Great Ormond. It was in Conway Hall, quite a big crowd, and so one was of Hindu origin and one was of Muslim origin, but actually I think the Hindu one was more or less observing, but the other one was not. Anyway, a humanist ceremony seemed right, and it was what the hospital wanted for all their colleagues, and friends, and the families came and they'd been consulted, and I went and interviewed both bereaved husbands. And it was a very moving occasion, and the climax for me was not anything I said, but the son of Mala Trivedi, who gave an extraordinary speech in which he talked about human solidarity. He said he'd been asked if he was angry at the people who'd done this, deprived him of his mother, and he said, I don't know. What I feel I do know is this: we must not allow events like this to make us hate in return. Little can come of it. And that perhaps is why the machinery of politics is so useful, in that it provides us with a productive way to try to stop such acts from occurring again. It is only right that we work together to attempt to eliminate the occurrence of such terrible deeds from the face of our planet. We must work at it because it is unifying, because it is our dream, and it is in fidelity to our dreams that we find strength, courage to go on, joy and happiness in our situation. Do I think it will work? I sincerely hope so, but I very much doubt it. Mankind has always affected a certain degree of self-harm. Some people have always murdered, others have always had to live with the consequences. Somewhere on this planet, a different tragedy is probably unfolding as I speak. Call it evil, call it what you want, it doesn't matter. What matters is this: we're all somehow unified by death, but there's more to life than its end, more to being than its cessation. Looking around, I find that that is exactly what this gathering is. It is a mix of the people who have suffered the consequences, people who feel indescribable pain and emptiness, but people who also react by bonding together in love to help each other move on through the difficult times to a better life. People who understand that when some of their own are down, they should remain to help them up again and to help them find peace once more. It is the front line of humanity. That is why I should thank you for being here today, and it is with that, ladies and gentlemen, that I hope you will join with me in finding the true beauty and joy of this, our continued existence. That was from a young man of 21, and I always encourage them to have people speak. I say, obviously I didn't know this person, so important to have contributors, other contributors, but
when you're actually collecting your information.
Yes, when I'm collecting the information.
You could get the one.
Oh yes.
Particularly like person, so you get the wrong information.
Yes, no, you usually, sometimes you're stuck with one person and there isn't time and there's nobody else, but I often get a phone number. I often say, well, don't you think I should speak to her? And just to get a bit of background, would you give me a number and I'll call? So, what I usually set aside is 2 hours to meet the next of kin, whoever it is, and usually they've got a friend or there's somebody else there. But I am, as I say, not least because of that experience, I am conscious of the dangers of just using one source. So you may follow it up with a couple of phone calls, but there's often not a lot of time. You usually have, a few, with shy families who are either too grief-stricken or not up to public speaking. I do the whole thing. At other times, it's just introducing a variety show. So really, everybody is different.
Well, I think we'll call time then. It's my pleasure to give a big thank you to Rupert. Apologies too for the noises off stage, which we've tried to complain about. If people can find another venue that's quieter, suggestions to Alice. But you rose above that very well, Rupert, and thank you so much for a most interesting and illustrative talk. And you're waiting for the call from the palace, are you?
That would be.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, we, as I said before.